The phrase, "Israel is a cancer in the Middle East," is a statement that carries significant weight and emotional charge. It's not just a casual comparison, it's a deeply loaded metaphor. Is a provocative metaphor, designed to elicit a strong reaction and shape perception. That frames Israel as an invasive, destructive force in the region, suggesting it's a malignant presence. A cancer implies something foreign and harmful, something that doesn't belong and actively damages its host. Suggesting Israel's existence is inherently pathological, not just a political entity with policies one might disagree with, but something fundamentally diseased, and must be removed for the region's health, implying a drastic and irreversible solution is necessary. This language goes beyond political disagreement. It transcends the realm of policy critique, casting Israel as an existential threat, a danger to the very being of the Middle East. The metaphor's roots lie in post-1948 Arab nationalist rhetoric, a period marked by significant political upheaval and conflict, which depicted Israel as a colonial imposition, an unwelcome intrusion by foreign powers, meant to divide the Arab world, fracturing its unity and hindering its progress. By dehumanizing Israel, stripping it of its humanity and portraying it as a disease, the metaphor justifies calls for its elimination, making violence and aggression seem like legitimate solutions, and rejects any possibility of coexistence, precluding any peaceful resolution or compromise. Understanding this phrase requires examining a deep dive into the historical events and grievances that have shaped the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader dynamics of the Middle East that fuel such extreme sentiment, the anger, frustration, and despair that underlie this kind of rhetoric, including wars with their devastating consequences, displacement, the forced removal of people from their homes and lands, and occupation, the control of territory by a foreign power. For many Jews, the metaphor echoes anti-Semitic tropes, historical stereotypes, and prejudices that have long depicted Jews as a corrupting force, a hidden hand undermining society from within, making it especially hateful, a painful reminder of past persecution and discrimination. Our analysis will explore these layers, peeling back the different meanings and implications, aiming for a nuanced discussion, a balanced and thoughtful examination of the conflict's core issues, the fundamental disagreements and challenges that stand in the way of peace, and why this metaphor is so widely condemned, seen as inflammatory, harmful, and counterproductive to any constructive dialogue. Modern Israel's story begins with the late 19th century Zionist movement, which sought a Jewish homeland in what was then Ottoman Palestine. The 1917 Balfour Declaration and subsequent British mandate fueled Jewish immigration, intensifying tensions with the Arab population. Competing British promises to Jews and Arabs bred mistrust and violence, culminating in the Arab Revolt of the 1930s. After the Holocaust, global support for a Jewish state grew, leading to the 1947 UN partition plan, accepted by Jews, rejected by Arabs. Israel's 1948 Declaration of Independence triggered invasion by neighboring Arab states and a war that expanded Israel's territory. Over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, creating a refugee crisis that remains unresolved. For Arabs, Israel's creation was a humiliation and a colonial imposition, setting the stage for decades of hostility. These foundational events continue to shape the conflict's narrative and grievances. The 1967 Six-Day War dramatically reshaped the region, with Israel capturing the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Golan Heights. This victory tripled Israel's territory and placed over 1 million Palestinians under military occupation. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza became the conflict's central focus, fueling Palestinian demands for self-determination. UN Resolution 242 called for Israeli withdrawal in exchange for peace, but implementation stalled. The war's outcome shattered pan-Arab unity and forced some states to reconsider their approach to Israel. For Israel, the victory brought security, but also the challenge of ruling over a large, disenfranchised Palestinian population. The legacy of 1967 remains at the heart of today's disputes. The cancer metaphor, when applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is not accidental. It's a deliberate tool, carefully chosen for its inflammatory impact and its ability to shape perceptions. It's frequently used by groups and states that fundamentally reject Israel's right to exist as a sovereign nation within any borders. Organizations such as Hamas, which openly calls for Israel's destruction, Hezbollah, a powerful political and military force in Lebanon, and Iran, a major state sponsor of groups hostile to Israel, all utilize this metaphor. The cancer framing isn't just casual language. It frames the conflict as a battle, a life-or-death struggle with no room for compromise. It paints a picture of a healthy body, the region, or perhaps the Palestinian people, being attacked by a malignant invader, Israel. This imagery is then used to justify calls for Israel's eradication, presenting it not as an act of aggression, but as a necessary surgery to save the patient. This kind of rhetoric is incredibly potent. It effectively mobilizes support for armed struggle, casting violence as a form of medical intervention. More subtly, it delegitimizes negotiation and diplomacy because you don't negotiate with a cancer, you excise it. The metaphor reduces the complex political and historical realities of the conflict to a simplistic dichotomy of good versus evil, with Israel invariably cast as the latter. State-controlled media outlets and political cartoons frequently amplify the metaphor, embedding it deeply within the public consciousness. This amplification often involves blending anti-Israel sentiment with overtly anti-Semitic imagery, further demonizing Israelis and Jews in general. The cancer metaphor, unfortunately, is echoed in some protests and demonstrations worldwide, particularly those focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, it's important to note that its use is divisive even among pro-Palestinian activists and supporters. Many within the movement actively reject it as counterproductive and inherently hateful, recognizing the dangers of dehumanizing language. They argue that it alienates potential allies who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause but repulsed by such rhetoric, and that it often crosses the line into hate speech. Therefore, the use of this metaphor marks a significant dividing line within activist circles and the broader discourse surrounding the conflict. It separates those who are genuinely seeking viable political solutions and peaceful coexistence from those who are embracing a more absolutist and uncompromising stance. Ultimately, its power lies in its insidious ability to erase nuance, complexity, and the shared humanity of all parties involved from the discourse, paving the way for further polarization and violence. The Israel is a cancer metaphor echoes centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes that depicted Jews as a corrupting or pathogenic force. Nazi propaganda used similar language, framing Jews as a disease to be eradicated, a legacy that makes the metaphor especially chilling for Jewish communities. Applying this dehumanizing language to the Jewish state denies its legitimacy and humanity, reducing millions to a malignant entity. It erases Israel's complex history and the deep Jewish connection to the land, justifying violence and rejecting coexistence. Many critics, including those opposed to Israeli policies, draw a line between legitimate criticism and rhetoric that targets Israel's existence. Using such metaphors shifts focus from policy to existential delegitimization, a hallmark of modern anti-Semitism. This is why the phrase is widely condemned as hate speech. Central to understanding Palestinian anger, it's crucial to examine the core issues at the heart of the conflict. These are not merely abstract concepts, but deeply felt experiences that shape the daily lives and future prospects of Palestinians. Paramount among these are the issues of land loss and displacement, which have been ongoing for decades. This tragic history began most notably with the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, when the majority of Arab residents were either expelled from their homes or fled in fear amidst the fighting. This event remains a defining trauma for Palestinians. Since then, generations have grown up in refugee camps, often in conditions of poverty and uncertainty, tenaciously holding on to the hope of return to their ancestral lands, a dream passed down through families. However, this hope is met with the reality that Israel steadfastly rejects the right of return, citing demographic concerns and the need to preserve its Jewish majority. Further exacerbating the situation was the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which significantly deepened existing grievances and created new ones. This occupation subjected Palestinians to prolonged military rule, characterized by daily restrictions on movement, economic activity, and basic freedoms. Adding to the complexity, Israeli settlements have been established and expanded in the West Bank, a practice considered illegal under international law by most of the international community. These settlements are widely viewed by Palestinians as land grabs that actively undermine any realistic prospect for a viable and independent Palestinian state. These interconnected realities, displacement, ongoing occupation, and the relentless expansion of settlements, inevitably fuel resistance, deep-seated anger, and a sense of profound injustice. The persistent lack of a viable political solution to address these core issues allows these grievances to fester and intensify over time. This creates fertile ground for the spread of extremist narratives, which exploit the despair and frustration felt by many. For a significant portion of the Palestinian population, the ongoing and seemingly endless loss of land and fundamental rights leads to a questioning of Israel's very legitimacy, perceiving its actions as fundamentally unjust and unsustainable. This complex and deeply rooted context is essential for understanding the persistence and intensity of extreme rhetoric within the conflict. Religion intensifies the conflict, with Jerusalem's holy sites at its heart, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Israeli control over East Jerusalem and clashes at the Al-Aqsa compound fuel outrage across the Muslim world. For some religious Zionists, the West Bank is divinely promised land, justifying permanent settlement. Islamist groups like Hamas frame the conflict as a religious war, elevating it beyond politics and making compromise harder. The military imbalance is stark. Israel's advanced army faces Palestinian groups using asymmetric tactics. Israeli operations in Gaza and the West Bank often result in high Palestinian civilian casualties, fueling accusations of brutality. Images of destruction reinforce the narrative of Israel as an oppressor, deepening hostility and justifying extreme language. These religious and military dynamics entrench the conflict and shape its rhetoric. Israelis see their state as a vital refuge after centuries of persecution, viewing existential threats as real and security measures as necessary. Many feel their narrative is ignored by a world focused on Palestinian suffering. For Palestinians and many Arabs, Israel's creation was a colonial injustice that displaced their people and upended the region. The ongoing occupation and blockade are seen as proof of expansionist ambitions. While some Arab states have normalized ties with Israel, popular sentiment remains pro-Palestinian. Western powers are divided. The U.S. is Israel's staunch ally, while Europe is more critical but maintains strong ties. Public opinion in the West is increasingly split, with social media amplifying Palestinian voices. These divergent perspectives create a chasm of understanding, making resolution elusive. The "Israel is a cancer" metaphor is a call for eradication, not dialogue, rooted in deep grievances but ultimately dehumanizing and destructive. Addressing the conflict requires recognizing the real suffering, displacement, occupation, and power imbalances that fuels such language. Lasting peace demands moving beyond toxic metaphors to a discourse grounded in rights, law, and mutual recognition. Criticism of Israeli policies is legitimate, but must avoid rhetoric that denies Israel's right to exist or invokes anti-Semitic imagery. Security concerns must not justify collective punishment or denial of Palestinian rights. Progress requires acknowledging both people's aspirations and ending the occupation through a just political solution. Without this shift, the cycle of violence and hate will persist. The first step is to speak of one another as human beings with legitimate histories, rights, and fears.